So y'all, here's what we are going to cover tonight. Okay. Why relationships are the heart of advocacy. So we're going to get back to something that we talked about early on in the course with one-to-one relational meetings and building consensus. So we're going to touch back on some of those themes, and I'll sort of make the case that relationships are really at the heart of effective advocacy. I want to talk a little bit about some typologies of advocacy. So some various ways to think about what it means to be an advocate, some categorizations for those advocates. And then to really give you a sense of, give you a chance to think about where you fall in terms of your own advocacy and how you have been an advocate in the past and how you may want to be an advocate in the future. And then we'll wrap up the presentation portion of this with a little bit of background that I'll share in terms of political communication with elected officials. I've learned some things over the years that I want to be able to share with you all, and I know that you all have learned many things over the years as well. So we'll be able to have an opportunity for folks to share what you've learned too. Okay. So I want to start with this quote from Archimedes because I love this quote. When I first saw it, I was like, wow, this is so great. Give me a lever and a place to stand and I will move the world. I think that's a beautiful thing, right? You know, for me, and you'll see this more later on, my lever was bicycles, right? And my place to stand, at least early in life, was in the basement of a church where I started this little bike co-op. And it was amazing from that little basement, right? And with bicycles and teaching people how to fix brakes and overhaul bottom brackets and adjust handlebars, et cetera, how much I felt like I was able to really make a positive difference in the world. But what's missing when you think about this quote, right? Give me a lever and a place to stand and I'll move the world. You even see old Archimedes here, right? With his lever and moving the world. But what's missing here? What's missing is the people. You are moving through this class as an individual, right? And I talk to my students about this all the time. You are an individual matriculating through the world, trying to accomplish what you want to accomplish, but you also belong to communities, right? You belong to a neighborhood. You belong to families. We belong to a nation, right? And so as we go through this course, one of the things that we wanted you to think about is how can you sharpen your effectiveness as a leader, right? And this means as a person who is working with and representing neighborhoods and neighborhood groups, right? So Archimedes with his lever, right, moving the world, that's a great image because it really can be very empowering for you as an individual. But when we think about doing neighborhood-based work, we have to think about that in the context of a group. And there are times when you as a leader will have to mobilize a constituency in order to make clear to public officials that you have built consensus within that group, within that community, around a particular policy choice. And that's what I really want to get into tonight, is how you build that consensus, right? We talked about that previously, but how you then can advocate from a place of legitimacy, right? From a place of power. Power being defined here as the ability to achieve your purpose. How can you advocate from a position of power in order to achieve the policy outcome that not only you believe is best for your neighborhood, but that your group, the community that you belong to, your neighborhood believes is important as well? And that's why it's all about relationships. And this comes back to the one-on-one meetings that we discussed in week 3. Hopefully you all were able to develop a one-on-one meeting with someone in your neighborhood or someone that you work with to practice that skill, to use those tools that we provided back in week 3. Because the heartbeat of excellent advocacy is strong relationships. That's my main thesis for tonight, right? And that includes relationships with your neighbors, as well as relationships with elected officials. And I'm going to get into both of those, right? In terms of how you build and develop those relationships for the purpose of advocacy with neighbors, and how you build and develop those relationships with elected officials for the purpose of advocating towards a shared purpose. If there's nothing else conceptually that I talk about tonight, this is the one thing that I want you to take away and remember from this class. When we think about advocacy, This to me comes down to a pretty basic framework. On the one hand, developing constituents. And then secondly, mobilizing constituents. And I'm going to break this down. I'm going to explain what I mean by these two things. But I think if you can get this down, and there may be some success that you all have already had as neighbors and as advocates and as leaders in your communities, if you can get this down, developing constituents and mobilizing constituents, then I think you can be very effective in your advocacy work. And this has definitely been my experience. Going back to week 3 again, we talked about building relationships with neighbors as you move towards consensus, right? Those relationships with your neighbors, that's the grassroots, right? This week, right, we want to think as well about how you build relationships with the grass tops, those appointed or elected officials, folks in positions to make decisions that are going to affect your life, that are going to affect your neighborhood. So I want to talk about effective preparation, communication, and then follow up with regards to advocating your position on particular matters of public policy. But the bottom line is, again, you are not the only person living in your neighborhood. You're not the only person concerned about the development that could be coming in. You're not the only person concerned about the new geometric configuration on the roadway. You're a part of a community, right? You're a part of a group of people who are constituents for the public policy makers that you want to advocate with, right? And you're going to get to see some good old compromising photos of me. So if you get nothing else from this class, at least you're going to get a laugh from some old photos of me. I want to talk first about these constituents, right? And I use the terminology developing constituents very intentionally. Just because somebody lives on your block or just because somebody is in your neighborhood doesn't mean that they are a constituent in the sense of having been developed to think about themselves as a constituent with the ability to actually engage with their policymakers to make a difference, right? So I want you all as leaders, when you're thinking about advocacy, to think, how can I actually develop these citizens, these folks who are in my neighborhood, into constituents to where they have an awareness of what's going on in the neighborhood. And then they also have a willingness to engage on issues that are affecting the neighborhood. So how can you develop constituents? How do you move people from just being neighbors to being an engaged constituent, right? I put parties at the top of the list because they're super fun. I remember at the beginning of the course, we heard about the driveway parties from our panel of neighbors, and what a good idea that was. Having a driveway party is an excellent way to just get people to start thinking about your neighborhood, to be thinking about some of the things that are going on and to start to build those relationships. You can also do some awareness campaigns. So an awareness campaign could be as formal as having a neighborhood meeting and raising awareness about something that's about to happen. It could be canvassing in the neighborhood, so actually passing out flyers about something that's going on, but just some way to touch the consciousness of other people in your neighborhood to make them aware of something that is going to directly impact their lives. There could also be educational initiatives, right? So maybe, for example, I lived in Midshooks Run for a while. They had a little thing going on where they were actually talking about the history of the neighborhood and how it was developed, right? And that was just a way for folks to get plugged in and start to think, oh, wow, I live in this place that has a history. Now I have some knowledge about that history. And by the way, I'm meeting other neighbors while I'm in this space, right? And then the last thing I want to hit on is what I think can actually be one of the most effective ways to develop constituents, to move people from just being a neighbor or a citizen to being an engaged constituent. And that's through programs or volunteer opportunities. So I have a picture of me here from the bike shop like 20 years ago. And one of the reasons that I post this is because part of the reason that we had success in Memphis is because we were able to get folks down into the bike shop, working on bikes. They were able to get out on the streets as a bicycle rider. And then suddenly they started to think about the roadways differently. They weren't just thinking about other people riding bikes. Suddenly they were someone through this volunteer program who had developed their own bicycle, who had gotten out onto the streets. And now they have an awareness, and this is the most important part, an interest in making sure that our streets are more safe for people who are riding bicycles. Can you find volunteer opportunities or programs where people start to think, wow, I now care about what's going on in my neighborhood. I'm not just a passive bystander, someone to whom decisions are made on behalf of, or to whom decisions are impacting them. I'm now someone who is actively engaged in and concerned about the things that are going on in the neighborhood because I've been a part of some process, right? So when we talk about developing constituents, this is what I mean by that. Moving people from being someone who's just a bystander, a constituent, a neighbor, to being engaged, someone who's actually interested in and willing to work on some of the challenges that you're going to face in your community. Developing constituents, right? This is very important. And the second thing here, and I share this is from a rally that we had back in 2010. This is our former mayor, A.C. Wharton, and we essentially organized a number of people, and by a number of people, I mean over 100, to get down to City Hall because the city, long story short, had made a promise to install bike lanes, and then they said, we're not going to do it. Because we had worked so methodically for so many years with people in the community to help them fix bikes, because we created a volunteer space where those individuals could show up, be a part of that community. Because they were interested now and they had an interest in bike infrastructure, when the time came and we had to tell the city, listen, y'all got to keep your word on this. You told us one thing and you're about to do another. They were willing to mobilize and rally down at City Hall. And that's what we did. And we took 100 people on bikes. We told the mayor we were coming. We told all the press we were going to be there. And the mayor came out, and what he did on that day was incredible. He said, not only are we going to build the bike lanes we said we were going to build, we're going to build 50 miles more than that. And he turned that rally into an opportunity to basically have a public relations win. That was moving from developing constituents, people who had an interest in what was going on in the community, to mobilizing those constituents. We developed a strategy, and in this case, we wanted to be able to apply some public pressure to the city. We organized, literally, here's our meetup point. Here's going to be our route to downtown. Here's where we're going to meet up downtown. If you can't ride down there, you can at least be down there. We communicated. We did this effectively through the media. We issued press releases. We had statements, right? And then we had follow through. So we were able to follow up with the mayor's office and build relationships with his staff, such that then now Memphis has become known as one of the better bike cities in the country. This was a turning point moment in that process. I put down here as well, evaluate, because when you go through the process, right, of building a campaign, an advocacy campaign, you're implementing some of what you're doing, you want to be able to look back on it and say, what went well about that and what might we want to change about that? We were successful in this case, but I can share just as many examples of where we were not successful. And so the evaluation piece is so important. I'm going to pop back to this slide here. Developing constituents. How do you get folks to realize they have an interest in what's going on in their neighborhood? And then when the time comes, if they have that interest and they feel that they can be a part of the change in their neighborhood because they've been a part of a meeting or a block party or a volunteer program, when the time comes where you need to really advocate for something, then you can mobilize those constituents. This is the basic learning point that I want to share with you around building collective groups for collective impact. Okay, let me just pause there and see if there are any thoughts. Anybody want to raise their hand before we go to the next portion here? We've got you all so well at waiting till the presentation is done. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so 3 different typologies of advocacy to consider. There are more, but I just wanted to give you all sort of a few categories to really sink your teeth into. The first one I would talk about is the community elder. And many of you, may be that. And I don't mean necessarily elder in terms of age. I just mean someone who is recognized in their community for being a consistent voice for change. someone that, has built relationships, that is trusted, someone that, has established themselves because of their ability to consistently show up, to have information and facts, and to be there for other people in their neighborhood when issues arise, right? We can all probably think of folks, right, in our neighborhoods who serve as that kind of community elder. We often look to that person for direction, right? Or maybe, again, maybe you are that person. That's such an important typology in advocacy, because particularly if you're new to advocacy, or you're like, oh, I'm really fired up about something, right? It's always important to think maybe someone else has already worked on this issue. Maybe someone else has already done something on this. Maybe there's something I have to learn about this. So when we think about the community elder, right, that's someone that we want to sort of identify and connect with, certainly before we organize any formal advocacy campaigns, to be in conversation with that person, right? Not only out of a sense of respect, but just out of a strategic purpose, because you can learn something from that person, right? That person, I think, is also perceived, by city officials, elected officials, and public officials, is someone who can have credibility, right? And the other two that I want to talk about, right, the community elder can maybe fall into one of these categories. The consensus builder, right? I've kind of flirted with calling this person the consummate partner, somebody that the city, the county, whoever that you're working with, feels that they can partner with. This is someone that they feel can be a reliable co-conspirator in developing gathering public input, right? Or developing buy-in for a particular project. Someone that they believe in their neighborhood can bring people together around a common cause, right? And I'm telling you, like, having worked with city officials, and maybe for some of you having been in these processes before, right? We know that, public officials, people in positions of power, decision makers, they see certain people, right, who occupy this role, and they see and understand that, right? So when you think about your own advocacy, right, how do you think you're perceived by folks who are making decisions, people to whom you're going to advocate? Do you think they see you as a community elder? Do they think they see you as a consensus builder? Or maybe there's another category, right? Antagonists. And it's important to have antagonists, right? Gadflies would be another sort of word for this. People who are going to raise their voice and say, this isn't right, and I'm going to tell you that it's not right. It's wrong. The antagonist plays a crucial role because often it can shift the dialogue, right? Away from, hey, we all just agree that this is the way things should be, towards, no, we really have a problem here. So there's a crucial space for the antagonist. It's also important to recognize how the antagonist can be perceived by people who are in positions of decision-making power and authority, right? That person may not be seen as someone who could be a partner, someone who could be worked with by the city, by the establishment, right? And maybe that's okay for the antagonist. Maybe the antagonist says, my power comes from the community. My power comes from knowing that I'm right, and that I'm on the right side of history, and that I'm advocating for the right thing, right? But again, it's important to have an awareness of where you might fall within these typologies of advocacy, as well as how you might be perceived by people who are in decisions of authority, who have decision-making power, right? The community elder, the consensus builder, the antagonist. Obviously, there's more categories for advocacy, right? But these are at least a few to get you thinking about, where do I fall in this milieu? And maybe it's a different category, right? And if that's the case, that's also important and good and really essential to name. So when we talk about advocacy, I just want to provide a couple of categories for you to think about, and then we'll get into some specific skill building here. Campaigns or initiatives. So, in a lot of the work that we did with the bike lanes, we had some specific campaigns, and I'll give you an example. There was a particular project on a street called Madison Avenue, and many of the business owners opposed putting in a bike lane on Madison Avenue. They were afraid that reducing the roadway from 4 lanes of traffic to 3 lanes, basically 1 lane in each direction and a turn lane, would negatively impact their businesses. This is a debate that's been had in cities all over the country. It's one that's been had here. And in this case, we had a number of businesses that really were coming out against the bike lanes. So for us in the advocacy community, what we wanted to do was raise awareness around all the businesses that did support the bike lane. So we organized a bicycle-friendly business drive, and we went door to door on Madison Avenue and basically asked every business whether they'd be willing to support the Madison Avenue bike lanes. And if they said yes, we gave them a little sticker to put in their window. This was a campaign because it was a time-bound project. It had a beginning and an ending date. It was focused on a very specific objective, getting bike lanes on Madison Avenue. And it was clear, right? It was either something that it was either kind of a yes or a no, right? We kind of win or we don't. And so a campaign or an initiative, right? It's a way to generate advocacy energy, a way to build power. And it's a way of containing that, right? Within a time-bound space where you say, here's when we're going to start, here's when we're going to end, and here's our objective. So you have a pretty clear measure of success. Public communications can be a part of a campaign, right? Or in and of itself, it can also be a form of doing advocacy. What do I mean by that? If you're running a campaign, to come back to the Madison Avenue thing, you may want to put editorials in the local newspaper to say, hey, here's a business owner. This business owner says, we want bike lanes on Madison Avenue, and here's why. This is why we think it's important. And we're writing from the business perspective, right? So that's a piece of communication, right? That's a part of a campaign. There may also be some ways in which you're not necessarily running a campaign, but you want to raise awareness around something that's going on. For example, pedestrian safety. Maybe it's been a particularly tough year for pedestrian fatalities. Here in Colorado Springs, you know, we have too many pedestrian fatalities. So maybe in order to create an environment where you can advocate effectively, you start to raise awareness about that issue. So you put out an editorial, right? Or you release some public facing material in the newspapers, or you do some interviews, or you get on KRCC or whatever it is, and you start to raise awareness, right, around pedestrian issues, you know, here in Colorado Springs. So this is another feature of effective advocacy. In some ways, it's about creating the conditions for a campaign, or it could be a particular tactic that you use within a campaign. But that's still another way to build power as you work as an advocate. I put programs down here as well, because there may be some ways in which you want to actually, you know, build a program. Again, going back to that model of developing constituents, right? So what does your program look like? Well, maybe your program is, you know, a weekly creek cleanup. Maybe you're particularly concerned about litter, right? In the park, I was in Midshook's Run, and you know, they would regularly organize creek cleanups. So when I say program, what I mean by that is, you know, there's a specific activity that you're going to do, right? And that's going to be consistent, and people are going to be able to show up for that. So it's programmatic, right, in nature, in that sense, right? Something that you're consistently doing that people can get involved in. And by the way, through that, you're building some awareness around the issue of litter, right? Or making sure our waterways are clean. And maybe that program leads to some specific advocacy campaigns to either clean up that waterway or to be able to create some new policies or ordinances around the waterway or litter or whatever that looks like, right? But developing a program that can also be part of creating an effective advocacy environment. Excuse me, I'm going to let my dog out 1 second. And lastly, and this is what we're going to really get into as we sort of transition to our activity, is direct advocacy to policymakers. So whether you're running a campaign or an initiative, whether you're engaged in public communications, whether you're running a program, at some point, a lot of effective advocacy ends up with direct communication to policymakers. And so I want to give you some baselines for thinking about how to do that effectively, create a little space for you all to share out how you've done that effectively. And then we're going to practice and we'll develop some advocacy pitches. Then we'll get some feedback from Jill as we go into that activity. This is pretty important because even though we live in a time, I think, where many folks still lack maybe faith in the public process, and Do arguments really sort of sway the day? Do they really make a big difference? I think Joe could tell you, and many other policymakers could tell you as well. If you have a strong argument and you have constituents and you're able to articulate that argument in a meaningful and effective way, you can make a difference on issues of public policy. It does make a difference. And in particular, right, you got to think about all the decisions that get made at city council, county commission, state legislature, US Congress. There's so many decisions that get made all the time, right? And so as we think about how to be effective in those spaces where we're communicating directly to policymakers, right, we want to keep a few things in mind. Firstly, what is your goal? When you sit down and you try to have that conversation with a policymaker, do you just want to be heard? Or do you want to change a policy? Maybe you feel like regardless of what you say or your group says, this policy isn't going to get changed. Maybe they'll actually hear you, right? But this policy is not going to change. So maybe part of the purpose for that conversation is building or deepening a relationship with that policymaker for a later fight, for a later conversation, right? And one thing to bear in mind, if you're going to go into that meeting with a policymaker and it's just you, often you're going to be perceived as a lone wolf. Folks are going to want to know, who's with you on this? I see you and I hear you. But where are other people on this? For folks who are accountable to voters, literally at the ballot box every 2 years or every 4 years, that's a question they have to answer. Where are other people on this? They need to know that. So when you sit down with a policymaker, you want to make clear that you have support and that there are other people who are with you. Did you build consensus around a position? In other words, is this just Anthony Siracusa saying, it'd be really great if I had a bike lane over on Colorado Ave? Or is this a group of neighbors who have thought about this, who have analyzed the other options, who have thought about the angles, who've put themselves in the policymaker's role, and who have ultimately concluded this is the best thing for our community? Did you build consensus around this? Or is this just Anthony talking? Are you mad about it? Are you mad? Are you going to come in and somebody's going to see you being mad? And that's all they're going to remember. They're not going to remember your argument. They're not going to remember the data. They just knew you were mad. Anger can be very important as a motivator, right? But it's often not very effective as a lead strategy in communicating with political officials. Do you just want that elected official to realize that you are right and they are wrong and you are going to tell them about it? What is your goal going into this meeting? I just want to share from my 2 cents, since I got the chance to lead class tonight. This is what I perceive as an excellent outcome of all good advocacy. And this is a goal that I think you want to consider aspiring towards, because your objective is not going to be reached every single time. Sometimes you're going to win, sometimes you're going to lose. Sometimes you're going to get what you want, sometimes you're not going to get what you want. But if you can inspire other people around you to be involved in the process, then you've run a good advocacy campaign. Because if you can strengthen the civic fabric of your neighborhood through these kinds of advocacy processes, you may not get this one, but you're stronger when the next one comes along. And we know there'll be a next one, whatever it is. Can you inspire other people to be involved in the process through your leadership? If you can do that, then regardless of whether you win this time, you will have achieved something through your advocacy. Okay. We're going to move now to the final portion of the presentation, and then we're going to get into our activity, y'all. Firstly, whenever you sit down with an elected official to have an advocacy conversation, you do not want that to be the first time you talk to that elected official. You want to build a relationship with that person before you ever sit down in their office and ask them for something. So how do you do that, right? You can assist them with their campaigns. Everybody who's in an elected office had to run a campaign, right? They're always going to have something going on. So you can knock doors for them, make phone calls, organize an event. You can assist with and attend their fundraisers. Often elected officials are having town halls. A lot of them are virtual now, right? So you can just show up and ask a question in the chat or whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm in Mark Snyder's House district, and he's always having town halls, right? And so it's a great opportunity to connect with an elected official. Let them know, hey, I'm around, I'm engaged. You can also invite them to your events, and especially if there are cameras around. Elected officials like to be seen at places where they can take a picture, especially if it's a positive thing, right? So, we're just a little real talk here. So, but seriously, folks typically, these are civic minded people. That's why they ran for office. And so if you can invite them to be present in the community, if they're available, typically they'll come out, and often they're flattered to be asked. Obviously they have busy schedules, so they can't attend everything. But these are just some ways to build relationships with elected and appointed officials. By the way, this is true for planners as well. And many of you probably know this, but if there's a meeting that's being held by the city engineer, right, or Christian Nelson over at Colorado Springs Utilities, go out there and meet with those people. Oftentimes those appointed officials, or folks who serve at the pleasure of the mayor or the council, those folks have power too. And so building relationships with them and figuring out ways to develop those relationships, very important before you have any advocacy meeting. All right, so council people and mayors and folks here at the local level, they're often pretty accessible to us. And so, we had Stan Vanderwerf and Nancy Henjum with us at orientation. And I'm sure if you follow up with them and you try to schedule some time, you can do this, and you can often get on their calendars, and sometimes I'll have lunch with you or whatever. When you're talking about setting up a meeting for the purposes of advocacy, I'm thinking about this both through the lens of Congress and here locally. Sometimes you have to go through a scheduler, but just in general, one thing I would just want to make sure that you all do is to write them at their public email addresses, and make sure that they get that meeting request and get it on the calendar. Oftentimes folks will want to know that you're a constituent, and meaning you're in their district. And so this isn't true for everyone, but sometimes people will only meet with their constituents, and that's often true just because they have limited time, right? And so, we have at-large council folks here as well as folks, right, we're in their districts, but you want to be sure, right, to tell them you're a constituent. And if you feel comfortable, share your address, right, and where you live, because that can be really, really helpful. If you're going to set up a meeting with multiple people, it can be helpful to share that all those people are constituents, right? And to share a list of those people, as long as other folks in your party feel comfortable. And then once you get your meeting set up, you definitely don't want to be late. Get there early, and be professional, right? I know we're like all Colorado casual out here, right? But wear professional attire to the meeting. And some of this may seem basic, but it's so important. I want to say one thing, because if you're going to do advocacy with Congress, you may be surprised, or maybe not, at the age of the people who you're going to be meeting with. But the truth is, this country is run by 23-year-old humans. And so often, if you have a chance to meet with an aide, that's just as good as meeting with their boss, because often their boss has so much on their plates, right, that it's difficult to be able to keep up with everything. So take that 20-something year old seriously, because often they have a deeper grasp on the issues than even their boss does. All right, so getting into the meeting itself, right? How do you communicate, right? What is the purpose? I touched on this a little bit earlier, but there's a difference between being heard and being persuasive. So one of the things that you want to think about is using language that makes sense to lawmakers and their aides. So for example, when we would go to Congress, when we would work with folks in the Republican Party, often they would say local control. This is a term that was very important to them. So we often would couch our asks in that terminology. On the other side of the aisle, there would be more receptivity to language like equity and inclusion, right? And so knowing who you're meeting with and what they care about, and framing the language that you're using to be tailored to that individual can make a huge difference. The other thing is, you want to celebrate and name the ways that their past votes have made an impact on the ground. So we got some specific grants and some funding in Memphis from our congressperson. And this was bipartisan. We had senators, and congresspeople on both sides of the aisle. And we would tell them, first thing we would say when we go in, thank you for this. It was wonderful to see the ways in which this made some specific impacts. It helped to create this bike ped crossing in Memphis. And then you want to be very specific about what you're asking of that person on that day. Now, you don't necessarily want to move specifically into the ask right away. Often you can take your lead from the representative, the person that you're meeting with. They may have more or less time, right? And so just kind of get a sense of where they are. But one thing that I'll say is most folks like to hear stories. And if you have a chance to actually meet with an elected official, many of them got into this work because they like to talk to constituents. They like to talk to people. And so as you prepare for your meeting, if you've got multiple people in that space, can each of them share a little story, right, about what you're talking about and why it's important to them? This can make it real for policymakers who are often hearing tons of data or are seeing form letters or petitions, right? But if you have a chance to tell a story and to keep it brief, right? I don't mean like, a heartbreaking work of staggering genius, but a short story, right? Give everybody the opportunity to share that. That can be really, really powerful. So if you give a little thought to this, right? If you've got your group, you've developed your constituents, you're mobilizing your constituents, you're giving them an opportunity to tell a story, and you have a specific thing that you want that policymaker to do, right? You can organize a great advocacy meeting that can be very, very impactful. And it can be much more impactful even than just having, a letter or sending an email, or certainly just being there by yourself. And then lastly, follow up, y'all. It is so important to be able to follow up with your policymakers. Oftentimes, if you don't send them a follow-up email, a lot of times, if you're feeling really moved, you can send them a handwritten note or something. But if you don't send them a follow-up, then it's almost as if you weren't there. You're off the radar again. And so being able to follow up, thank that person for their time, re-articulate your ask, right? That can be really helpful. Last thing I'll say before we move into the activities, you can make your specific ask, right? Councilwoman Gabler, will you support bike lanes on Colorado Avenue? You want to try to get that specific ask out, but you may not always get a clear answer. But it is important to be clear about what you want, right? But to couch it within this broader process that I've shared.